Hi, and we're still working with Sermon Distributor, so I'm going to use this preacher, which is a get that I already have set up here. I'll use that in our illustration. So here we can see that I have this backend view selected. So let me select nothing. This is usually how it will look when you start. So you'd select this, depending on which area of the backend you want to get the data from. You'd select Backend View, which is the best way to do it, I would say. Then there is the Joomla database option, which basically gives you the access to draw data from any other component installed that moment in the Joomla website. So if you select Joomla database, you can select any database that is actually at that stage on your database installed. And that means you can reach out to other components through this dynamicGet. I'm gonna not do that. In fact, that's also an area which I haven't tested so well. You possibly might try to implement that and run into some bugs, and at this stage I can't make any apologies for that, since really the thing you should do is instead using the Backend View option. Now you might say, but why is the other option there? Well, it's because that's a feature we certainly want in the application, right? And so I'm busy working in that direction and busy programming so that that feature will work without any problems. In fact, for the most part, if you don't do very complex mapping, so if you just do a simple direct database fetch like that, you'll be able to use this. It won't give you an issue. But it really is about these other linked or joint database structures that really would make it complex. So, and that might cause problems. I'm not 100% sure. Obviously it did work, but I haven't tested it well enough, as well as I have tested the other part, and that is this backend view. There is also the custom option, where you can just dump the whole option of using component builder to sort of write your PHP for you. And here you can add custom PHP that will add the methods data for you. So this is a custom get option where you write the code basically by hand, whereas this option writes the code for you. So you'd select the backend view that you want to use. Again, that backend view will be the view that you connected to your component, right? So you need to type that view name in here and then select that package, and it will load all the field names as a.id and a.assetID and a.name and alias and icon, and so these are all the fields inside of this view, and it will load it and it will put this as asset ID. Now again, I would suggest you don't change that. What you can do is you can take out a row if you feel, okay, I don't need that row. Then you can remove a row like that, and you can say, I don't need that row, I don't need these, all the way to there. Basically that's all the data you might want, and then you will know that this would be the variable name of the data on when this get is used. So that's the basic part of setting up a get. I need to mention that you have get types as well. Now the get types have 4 of them. There is the get item, which will get 1 item. So that means from this preacher table it will get 1 item. Then you got the get list query, which will get multiple items. Okay, so depending on how many items you want to get from the database, you would select either get item or get list. Then you got get custom, and then you got get customs, that's plural. And the difference between these two, or 4, is the get item is what you will use only once per view. So if you are building a custom admin view, you will select a main get, either of a get item or either of a get list. But you can add multiple custom get item or custom get items. So you can see these as other methods that you're adding to the page, but it's not the main method. So you have main methods, which are these get item and get list query, which by the way is the exact naming of the methods that will be used. And then you got this custom get custom and get customs, which is really almost the same as these two. It's just that they are not main. They will only be another method in the model which will bring data to the view. So you can add as many custom get custom and get customs methods to your view as you like, but you can only add one get item and you can only add one get list query. And usually the way we would decide on this is that we would say, what is the main objective of the view? What is the main data set that we want to use in the view? And that is what we will use the get list query and the get item for, respectively. So if the main purpose of the view is to show preachers, a list of preachers, I will use the get list query as the main selection here. Now you see that you have, when you do a list query, you have the option of adding pagination. So basically that would mean whether the data should only return a certain number. Now Joomla has a global number there, which you set in the system administrative area under your global settings. Let me show you that. So you would go to system, then global configuration, and then you see there is a default list limit. It's this one here, and that is what will be used as the amount that limits the data being returned to the page. So it will only return at this stage 20 items if I set that pagination to yes. And if I set it to no, it will load all the data. So yes would just load some of it, and no will load all of the data. So it depends on what you want to do. If you want to do an Ajax, or well, if you want to be sure that all the data is being loaded every time, and you rather use JavaScript to set up pagination for your view, then that is why you would use the no switch. Most of the time you'll just say yes, and Joomla will, Component Builder will automatically add the pagination code to the page. It will also automatically add the pagination code to the model, and at the bottom of the page it will show a 1, 2, 3 pagination. Now possibly depending on the template you're using and the styles that are on the page, if Bootstrap is not on the page, that 1, 2, 3 might possibly not look right, and you will need to add styling to it. Component Builder doesn't know what style is on your page, so it cannot make provision for all of that. But it actually can load the pagination itself, and it does do that. Okay. Now here you have data, and you can join this data to other database tables. And now again here, like with the main source, you're able to select joint views from a table, a view table, which is basically the views of the component, or just any database table. And so one of the database tables I often connect to is categories. You see, because Component Builder integrates its application, if you add a category field to any view, it dynamically sets up a category for your component and integrates the category concept into your component, so it writes all that code for you. And basically the way that Joomla's own applications like Article Manager does it, so it's using the same conventions. So if you know how Joomla Article Manager is bringing categories into the articles, then that is the way your component is going to do it as well. And here you can now select categories. You can say these switches I'll deal with when we come and look in more detail at this area, and then you can model the data there. And model, I mean decide what you want to return. You don't want to return everything from categories. But the one I want to look at first is actually this joint view table. We'll come back to the DB option. The joint view table lets you again select from any of the other views that is part of your component. And again, you can select whether it should return a single row or a list of rows. Now, when you say single row, it means it's going to literally join it to this other data set that you have as your main data or your main source. It will just be another item in the array. And so that's why you can't use the name, for example, here. It needs to have that that series underscore in front of it, so that it doesn't clash with the other data set that possibly also has a value called name. So again, here, if you selected, let me just select anything here, series, you'd see that it will populate this area with all the fields that is in that view. Then this as button here, basically you can't use the same alphabetic number twice in the whole query. So the whole get function can only use A once, and then B once, and then C once, and then D. And so you need to make sure that these are set up that you can. We've made provision up to ZZ. That's how many tables you can have only in this area here. And so basically you would first decide whether this row type, what type of return it will be. If you set it to multiple, you see that these names automatically update, because now the way that the get method will work is it will create a new method which will get this data and add it into your item list via this relationship. So I'm adding the on field as the .a series. That's where the ID is for the series. And the join field, I'm using the C ID, which is that one. So that means in the main database, that is the A database, there must be a field called series, and it has the ID of the series, and it corresponds to the ID in this list. And if I wanted to return a multiple, it means that the main database, which is in that case a sermon, can be linked to multiple series. But in the system we are working with here, that is not possible. You can only connect a sermon to one series. So that means it's certainly a single return. Then it will immediately add this series underscore in front of everything to ensure it doesn't clash with your A table. That's what it's basically doing. Again, you can remove the fields you don't want, but please do not edit the string. It possibly would make it break. I wanted it to be possible that you can change this name to anything you like, and we are going to try and do that eventually, but for now it still doesn't really like you doing that. And it in fact, you can be changing it and it'll still write it this way in the code. That's part of why I'm saying you shouldn't change it, not because it will break something, but because it will be ignored and you might expect something else than what it is actually doing. So it still is going to use this implementation even if you change it, but it will drop the fields you don't select. So if you say I don't want these, just like that, then it won't get those fields and you will only have this data returned. And again, here you can have equal, not equal, equal or not, and we also have the in function. That means if this joint value, if this on field is an array, then you can use the in function to make sure that it actually looks whether the ID is in this array. That's the in function. And again, remember when we started out, I told you that you need to be willing to get your hands dirty. Now, this code, if we go to the component itself, I'll show you where it writes this code. So let me scroll down to the bottom here and let's see. We're looking into sermon preacher ID. Now we'll still get to why it says preacher ID when we look at the filters and the where, but let us go to the code. There you can actually see, I'm going to refresh this page and then go to the code. Okay, so since this get is used in the front of the component, we will go to the front end and not to the admin area. So we'll go to the front end of sermon distributor, and then we are looking at the model, right? The get dynamic get is used in the model to get the data, and we are looking at sermons. Let me just make sure of that. Yes, it's sermons. It's getting a list query and it's using Pagnation, getting all this. So we're looking at sermons. So it'd be sermons under the preacher ID, so it should be this model. I'll still show you the way that I know all that, but just that I could get you into the code. Here you can see the main method, which actually has this .id, or the main data set, sorry, not method, data set. It is written here. And so here you can see ID, asset ID, name, alias, link type, sort description. And if you look at the UI, it says the same things: alias, link type, short description, icon, preacher, series, category ID. So this is where it writes it, and it shows you where in the compiler it's done that. Then it sets up the second one, series, you see. And then you can also see it says series equals CID. So series, there is series, equals the C, this table, series, ID. And then it also tells you what it wants from C. It wants the name and the alias, and then it wants a series name. It changes it to series. Since this is in the select query, this is one function there. And so that array and transposes to this array. That is the way that you make use of Joomla's database API. So it has a thing called quote name, which you can pass two arrays, and the first array being the actual name of the value, which in this case is name and alias, and then the second array what you want it to be once the query is completed. So it links this into the query one by one. You see all of those, even the category one is linked in here, and then it does a check whether there's an ID. And if it exists, it checks whether it's a string. If it's a string, it adds a quote, and if it isn't, if it's a number, it just adds it directly. And that is where the query is done. And here we basically return false if there's no ID. And so we'll look at this area in a moment. This is done through the filtering and the where. Okay, so I just wanted to show how it adds this preacher as well as series to the query. And so if we look at the back, open up here, you see it as series and preacher and statistics. But statistics, you see we select multiple statistics, because for one sermon there can be multiple downloads, right? So there's multiple statistics, or sorry, not multiple downloads, multiple files, and per file there will be a number. And so if we look at how it does that, it first does the query, and here in get item it actually adds a new function called get ID sermon statistics, and with a random key to ensure that it doesn't conflict with any other methods on the page. We had to add this random key here, and it puts it into this variable. And that's something that you need to come and look at, and possibly when we look at the site layout area as well as the templates, I'll be talking about this transition here again, and the fact that you need to know that it is in this variable. And I'm trying, inside of your layouts and your site views and these things, I'm trying to give you the correct name, but it is not watertight correct. Possibly you need to come check this if it doesn't just work. But again, I'll explain that when we get there. just that you know, we're adding the statistics into this variable through a method which is also on the page, and we're passing the ID of the sermon. So if you look at the UI, that's exactly what we're saying here. We're saying, okay, get statistics multiple, join to the left. Again, you can select any of these, and then use the main tables .aid must be equal to eSermon, and then this is the only values I want to return from the eSermon. So the eSermon is this value here. Okay, so I'm saying AID must equal eSermon, and then if you look at the code, it basically, if we go to this function, which should be just here it is, it takes that ID and places it next to eSermon, and it puts it into its place. Basically, also here's the two arrays, what it is in the database and what it should be now, and it checks whether it executes, checks whether it's got any arrays or any values, and then returns that as an object list, and that then gets placed inside of this sorry, where are we? Gets placed inside here. Okay, now you'd see this area here is actually custom scripting. And so if we go back to the dynamicGet, you see that there's a custom script area. And if we click on that, you'd see that there is different switches. You can select get list query, or before getting the items, or after getting the items. And if you select after getting the items and you place any code there, then that it gets dumped right after the initial items were received. It will add that code in there and then only return the items. So that is why you can model the data right there in the dynamicGet. You can write the code for the data after it's been get, and you can check. If I remove this code here, you'd see it tells you that there is an array of items where all values are, and then I'm just saying I want to be sure that those items are set and that they are there before I start doing a for each on them. And so again, here I'm using some double this 3 bracket component helper function to check whether the string is there and all kinds of things. So here you can dump some nice PHP. Even before getting the item, you can add some filters or get list query before the if this is model list. If this is item, you'd see that then there's a different set of switches available, and so it adjusts to the type of query type up here. Okay, coming back to this area, let's again look at the database table option. Basically, you see I selected category and it's a single row that's returned. I called it B. I joined it left and I said A cat ID must be equal to B ID, which is the ID of the category, and I only want the title and the alias. So that is how we set that up. Only the title and the alias, and it returns that for us. Then it links it in there, and that's part of what you saw here when you looked at the query option here. It's basically this section here. Now let's look at the filters. You see we have a filter, an aware, and an ordering and setting of globals. Now the setting of globals is if you have a value in this query that you possibly want to use in a custom query which isn't even set up yet, but I'm going to need this value in the model, then you can, through this global option here, you can set a global area. Now again, here you should maybe test it. There is an option of using this and state, where there's the different type of set types. You can set the value to state, or you can set the value to this. And here you need to know the key. So let's say I want to do the name. Oh, obviously in this case it's not going to work ideal because you've got more than one name. So usually this global function only functions well when you have returning a single item. So when you only do get item, not get list query, but you do get item, then this makes sense, and then you can give it a name, and it will add it to the global scope of the method, or the model rather, which you can then actually access through other model methods, which are custom methods. Okay, so that is setting the global. The filtering, you have a list of possible filtering. So depending on what you want to do, you might select ID or user or access level or group or category or tags or date. Now some of these are not really well formulated yet, like date doesn't work that well yet, but category does, user group, access level, user, and ID does well. This function variable works well as well, and array value, repeatable value, and other, all those already work very well, and you can already use them and implement them. Now the only way for you to really know exactly how it works, you need to know a little PHP, and then you need to compile it and go look in the code what it has done and where it's placed what. And that is why I showed you that this is all set in the model. Okay, so currently we are saying we wanted to do a J request get integer by ID. So this is the get area that I added. So if I look in the code, it says state the key, and it's this here. You see, and we said it's a function variable, so it doesn't change or adapt this at all. And then it says it must be equal to preacher. So what we are doing is, since component builder doesn't know whether this variable is going to be a string or an integer, that's why we have this function which first checks whether it's a string and then checks whether it's a number, and builds up the query respectively. You might feel that is too much, and you're possibly right, but that is the only way I'm able to implement it at this stage. And getting more developers involved might possibly improve this in the long run. Then you see there, get the access. Now we have a bunch of values that fire every time in a custom dynamicGet model, and it is these values, and oftentimes you might need these values. So instead of you having to do custom scripting to get these values on the page, we add these values dynamically every time. So the user ID, the group, the authorized group, the access level, the app, and then the input values, which by either URL or post is on the page, and it tells you that it's been initiated. So this is set to true, so that if you have custom methods like this one, get preacher, it checks whether it's been set, and if it has been set, it doesn't set it again, it can just use it. But if it hasn't been set, it sets it, and also again sets it to true. So these init variables, global variables, can then be used inside of the code, just like the global variable we spoke of earlier. Okay, so out of that global variable, we are actually accessing this levels, and so it's this one here, which basically has the get authorized view levels of the specific user that is now, accessed this model, or the view that this model belongs to. And if he is in these access levels, so you remember that public is another access level, and so if the user isn't signed in, he's a public, this will validate true in the query. Okay, so we set that up simply by adding access level in a access. So you must check in the main source table for a access and whether this user is in that. So that means you don't need to add a state key because the code is done for you. Okay, that is some of the filters. Then the where is you can add any table key equals to a certain value. Now that value could be another table like B field, or it could even be a global variable like we said we could set up. So it could also be an ID, a user ID. Now the user ID is already on the table, so it could be just user ID, that one. Or it could be, like we've done in this case, just an integer, which is 1. So we want to make sure that all the sermons returned is published, and if you have an unpublished sermon, it shouldn't even return it at all. Okay, so that's what we're doing with that. And that is setting up a get list query with PicNation through this ordering method. We're just saying use the A ordering and ascend. Now you can order all the items, just add as many as you like. Be sure that the table that you're ordering, you could even use a name, right? So it could be a name as an ordering table key. Then you can do it descending or ascending, and then it will be added to the query. Okay, so that is also adding ordering to the data set from your dynamicGet method. And so here with the joint view tables, you can do very nice dependency calls from other tables in the backend and bring the data together into one items array. That's basically what dynamicGet is for. And as you saw, we have the normal, what I call main source on the table, in the model, and then we have this other one called getPreacher. And so that is another dynamicGet function which we looked at. It's called this one, getPreacher. So if we open it, we see it's a custom, get custom, and we gave it a custom name called getPreacher. And this is its relationships. So it is basically having no relationship there, neither here. So it's not linking to other tables. It's simply getting the preacher's details right there. Simple as that. But it has a filter which is basically using the same integer and access levels as the filters. And it's also using a where, I suppose. Yes, published. And it doesn't need ordering because it's just one preacher, but I nonetheless added the ordering. I could actually delete this like that. And it doesn't have any globally settings. Okay, so that is the get preacher. And so from this settings here, I don't think there's custom scripting. Nope. From this settings here, component builder writes all this code up to there. You'd see that we have this function everywhere called UIKit.com, and then we're using a global method, a static method, get UIKit.com. It's a method that I built. If you know UIKit, if you don't know, go to get UIKit, or just Google it, .com. It's a JavaScript, HTML library, CSS JavaScript library, which really makes modeling of your views very nice and easy. And it has components that you can use, so like tooltip and modal and all these kind of modal is part of the core, but accordion is another component, and we don't load all of its components every time. So what we've done is we've written in PHP a method that looks at fields that are text area fields and normal text fields. No, mostly, okay, it's not looking at every field, it's only looking at text area fields and editor fields. So in this component, we know that this description field is a editor field, and so we are sending it to this method. Now you can go look at this method in your helper class. It's over there. Let me see, where is it? Okay, so here's the method. So it has the classes that already has been identified, which is what this initial this component area, field name, field value, model field name value is actually holding. It's holding any component names that already has been identified. This gets passed also here with the content. Then we check in the content whether there is a class UI UK underscore, and if it's not false, we start looping to check what are all the components that are in there. And here is the list of the components that are available. And so on the fly we are determining whether these components should be loaded just by looking at the content that was placed in the description field. And then we add it back to this array, so it updates this. So eventually you have an array of all those items. And in the view, if we go to the view, which in this case is going to be preacher, and we open the view.html, we get to a place which basically everything is going to be happening. So these are of the components that when Component Builder compiled the application, it looks inside of the content of your site view as well as your custom admin view, and it identified that these components must be loaded for UIKit, and so it places it here dynamically. But since you could have added some components inside of the script that is stored in the description area, it now has this get UIKit component, which basically reaches back into the model, and in the model gets this variables value through a method which is here at the bottom of the page. There it is, get UIKit component. Basically through this method it is reaching into getting that array, and once it has that array, we basically check whether it is set and whether it is an array, and if it is an array, we set it to the array that is already on this page. Then over here we loop through that array and we load in those components CSS and JavaScript as required, so that you always can be sure that the UIKit's needed components will be loaded on the page simply by a user adding some of that components to its description as style, because the way UIKit works is you just like Bootstrap, you just add the class name to the specific div or tag, HTML tag, and then it it activates the needed scripting around it, which is a nice library, but it's quite heavy and you don't want it on the page every time. Now I know you could have done this through JavaScript. In fact they have a way for you to do this through the JavaScript, but to me I felt let me do most of the work in the HTML, so we leave the load on the server, and that the browser already has much more leverage and freedom. So that's why we added this feature. This is maybe beyond the scope of the Get, the dynamicGet, but since we ran into it, I quickly mention it here. Okay, so it is also placed in the query that is developed by dynamicGet. That's partly where it fits. So once you've got your dynamicGet set up, you now will add these dynamicGets to either site views or to custom admin views. So these dynamicGets is what gets the data for you, and it's where you model the data that you want to work with, and you can then use them in site views and custom admin views. Now next up we will look at adding it to a site view, and how all of that works. Thank you for watching.